property terms. But the real question for me is to be found in what we would use the borrowing for. And my real worry was that we didn't have a budget that was a large-scale national mobilisation that you expect to see in the scale of a war, and for me, the crises that are now waiting for us in the pipeline.
If we are talking about issues of scale, though, can I just ask you, do you think that top-rate earners should have been taxed even more?
Yes, I do, but there are easier ways of doing this. Are things like just removing the right to have pension contributions offset at the higher rate of tax. We should have just limited them all to the basic rate of tax. We could have removed the ceiling on NI contributions that would have given us about another £11 billion. We could and should have introduced a whole series of measures that were specific taxes on the bonus culture, on executive share options, and specifically in terms of short trading, on a quite punitive tax on those companies and individuals who lease out their shares for speculative trading against them on the short-term basis.
Just very briefly, because we are running out of time, bearing in mind that the IFS is challenging the figures that the government is acting on, and the situation they suggest and others is far worse than the government is presenting, do you think that this budget might actually have lost your party the next general election?
No, because I think that it does attempt to be honest, or more honest, about the depth of the problems that we face. I wish we hadn't tried to claim that we would come out of this recession earlier than I think we will do. I think we could and should have addressed areas where we're likely to make cuts, which is, for me, the dumping of ID cards, the scrapping of the Trident renewal programme. But we should specifically have been looking at the green transformation programme that other countries are doing, and which will deliver jobs as well as an economic intervention, and none of that gets properly addressed in this budget.
Thank you very much for your patience and for being with us today. An awful lot to talk about on a subject we will return to, but I do want to save a little bit of time for another story, because you might have missed it. The budget dominated everything this week. You could be forgiven for not noticing. It's been a really very difficult week for Gordon Brown's representative here on Earth, a certain Mr. Ed Balls. Loyal Lieutenant, Children and School Secretary, Mr. Balls has worked alongside the Prime Minister for 15 years and was named last week as the alleged mastermind of the dark arts of Downing Street. Mr. Balls dismissed the claims as completely fabricated and malevolent nonsense. If bad headlines weren't enough to contend with, the former exam chief Ken Boston this week accused Mr. Balls and other ministers of sexing up evidence against him given to an official inquiry. Now, Dr. Boston, I should say, said there had been a plot to oust him. Some of the evidence against him had been a work of fiction. Mr. Balls' department said it was a genuine mistake, but with the Conservatives demanding an apology to Parliament, has this week done terminal damage to Mr. Balls' ambitions. Michael White.
Well, it hasn't done them any good, let's put it that way. It's difficult to unpick. A lot of score settling going on about the Damien McBride affair, and some of the newspapers which have been most outraged about his outrageous conduct are the very newspapers people like him deal with all the time. You know, they peddle a lot of the filth. We all know who they are, and so do they. So do their readers, probably enjoy it. So a lot of hypocrisy there. Well, Ed Balls was pretty close to Damien McBride and Gordon Brown in that inner circle. Clever fellow, Mr. McBride, smart fellow, but, you know, way out of line, and Ed Balls took a hit on that, and I think on balance he deserved it.
Well, how much of a hit? I mean, did he actually get away with it? Well, the one that got away, in view of the fact that, you know, the whole story really swam beneath the big shadow of the budget this week.
It did. It was a good week to bury this bad news if you're Ed Balls. I mean, the thing about it is, though, it just cannot help the public perception of Mr. Balls, particularly at this stage in the financial crisis and everything else. It is astonishing to learn that any Labour ministers or anyone senior up in the party was wasting their time, whilst they'd been throwing away our money, were wasting their time playing silly little plots like this. And as if his part-time job of allegedly smearing people weren't enough, it turns out this week that Ed Balls isn't really very good at his real job.
Well, let's not peddle filth, because we don't do that on this programme, but let's
we can
peddle...
start.
We'll peddle in speculation, because we do that all the time. There was a story suggesting that this is a man that knows he's not going to be Chancellor before the next election, so he might be manoeuvring perhaps to be leader of whatever comes next. Does that shoot a giant, great hole in that ambition?
Well, as I said, it doesn't do him any good. I mean, I think they're all manoeuvring a bit so that the people who told tales out of school about Ed Balls, Sunday Times, I think, last weekend, were trying to damage Ed Balls for that purpose. And they may have been promoting other candidates for the Labour leadership who would want the Labour leadership the way things are going at the moment. We mustn't be too pious. David Cameron has got a former editor of the News of the World at his elbow every day, and he's not hired for his knowledge of the finer points of taxation either, is he?
Right, well, good point. As we said, it was a pretty good week for Ed Balls, just because those difficulties got snowed beneath far too many big stories that were getting the attention, as Giles will reveal in his guide to the top political stories of the week. Giles.
Anita, you're quite right. It's quite clear when we have a set piece in the week, like the budget, it's always going to be the big hit on the pages of politics, bbc.co.uk/politics. It's always going to be the big story, so of course it's number one. But there are other stories about. I have been distracted out here on the green by Joanna Lumley. The audience have been distracted by the budget. There are 4 other places to fill, however. This is this week's Top of the Political Pops.
Hello, very good evening. Welcome to Top of the Pops.
At 5, a ballot box is tampered with and cries of Central Party interference. Not Zimbabwe, but a Labour Party candidate selection in Erith and Thamesmead. This tampering with the democratic process is surprising, but perhaps less than the fact that 7 people actually want to be a Labour MP right now. At 4, Security Minister Admiral Lord West sailed into choppy water, expressing pride in those who policed the G20 riots, despite the controversial kettling and 3 investigations into their conduct. He added thousands of officers had done a good job. Anyone who thought otherwise was nicked. At 3, a financial meltdown can wreck your week. Just ask local councils who thought it was cool to invest in Iceland and found millions of taxpayers' cash frozen when the country went bankrupt. This week's good news is they'll claw back 80 to 90% of it, then find better ways to waste it.
It strikes me that everybody's talking about this particular gentleman.
At 2, Gordon Brown does his Yule Grinner on the web, wrong-footing everyone trying to reform MPs' expenses by announcing his own plan.
We need to make the rules clear, and we also need to save money.
No second home allowance, but a new additional daily attendance allowance, i.e. being paid for turning up to work. To the rest of us, of course, that's just called a salary. And at 1, it's the budget. No sign of former Chancellor Gordon Brown's financial girlfriend, Prudence. Successor Alistair Darling seems to have nicked her wallet and kicked her out, not just of number 11, but the entire country. The biggest borrowing ever and higher taxes for the wealthy were the headlines, and a predicted economic growth of 3.5%. Duck, it's a pig!
From this edition of Top of the Pops, it's bye-bye.
Giles, thank you very much. Just before we go, on yesterday's programme, we ran out of time and we didn't give you the answer to our quiz, and I know you might not have slept very well because of that. Michael Heseltine was the author of Life in the Jungle. That is all we have time for this week. In the meantime, we're going to leave you with images of the mass protests by Tamils over the Sri Lankan government's ongoing conflict with Tamil tigers. Have a good weekend. Goodbye.
Why does my heart